When I moved into that small apartment, all I wanted was peace. My name is Jamie, and at 25 years old, I had finally decided to start over. Growing up in a small town with a family that never accepted who I am had left scars I wasn't sure would ever heal. Every conversation at home felt like a battleground. Every holiday dinner a minefield of judgment and disappointment. This new apartment, tucked away in a quieter part of the city, felt like my chance to finally breathe. The building itself wasn't much, just a modest brick structure with narrow hallways and creaky floors. But it had character. I liked the way the sun streamed through the windows in the late afternoon, casting golden patterns on the walls. It was here, amidst my boxes and scattered furniture, that I first noticed my neighbor. He was tall, muscular, and tan, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. His name, as I would later find out, was Aiden. Aiden was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. Even in the simplicity of a plain gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his presence filled the corridor whenever he passed by. But he wasn't friendly, at least not in the usual sense. He'd nod politely when we crossed paths, but never said a word beyond that. It was as though he carried an invisible wall around himself, daring anyone to break through it. At first, I thought nothing of him. I was too preoccupied with unpacking and adjusting to my new life. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't help but notice him more. The way he worked out early every morning, his sneakers pounding rhythmically against the floor above mine. The way he avoided eye contact, yet seemed aware of everything happening around him. There was an intensity about him that intrigued me. Despite the intrigue, my focus remained on finding connection in a different way. Loneliness was a quiet ache I carried everywhere. And one night, in a moment of vulnerability, I downloaded a dating app. It felt silly, almost desperate, but I wanted to believe that love, or at least companionship, was out there for someone like me. The app was simple enough. A few pictures, a short bio, and I was live. I scrolled through profiles, swiping left more often than right. Then, something caught my attention. A profile popped up, one that didn't show much. Just a blurred out face and the name Maverick 25. What really stood out was the location, less than 100 feet away. I froze. That had to mean they were in my building, right? Or maybe my floor? The thought made my pulse quicken. I debated whether to message, my finger hovering over the screen. Before I could talk myself out of it, I typed a simple "hi" and hit send. To my surprise, the reply came almost instantly. "Hey there," they wrote. Our conversation started cautiously, as these things often do. We talked about movies, music, and the city, skirting around anything too personal. Still, there was something about their words that felt familiar, like I already knew them. Over the next few days, our chats became more frequent, the kind that stretched late into the night. And yet, every time I asked about their real name or why their location was so close, they dodged the question. One evening, unable to contain my curiosity any longer, I asked directly, "Why does the app say we're so close? Are we in the same building?" There was a long pause before the response finally came. "Yeah, we are. I'm closer than you think." I stared at my screen, my heart pounding. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to say next. "Who are you?" I typed, the words feeling heavier than they should. Another pause, longer this time. Then came the reply. "Aiden, I'm your neighbor." For a moment, I thought I misread the message. Aiden, the quiet, brooding man who barely acknowledged me in the hallway. It didn't seem possible. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. His evasiveness, and the way he avoided eye contact, the subtle tension I felt every time we crossed paths. It all clicked. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my fingers trembling as I hit send. "I didn't think you'd understand," he replied. "No one does, and I can't let anyone find out. If people in this building knew, if my ex-wife knew." His words trailed off, but the weight of what he wasn't saying filled the silence. I felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. Despite his secrecy, I wanted to know more. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because I trust you," he wrote, "and because I want to see you. Tonight." That evening, I stood outside Aiden's door, my heart racing as if it might leap from my chest. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the wood. Was this a mistake? I barely knew him, yet here I was, about to cross a boundary I couldn't uncross. Before I could overthink it, the door creaked open, revealing Aiden on the other side. He wore a fitted black shirt that hugged his athletic frame, and his dark eyes seemed to pierce through me. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside. I walked into his apartment, immediately struck by how different it felt from mine. While my place was a mess of unpacked boxes and mismatched furniture, Aiden's home was pristine. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a faint scent of cedarwood lingered in the air. It was cozy but minimal, like someone who spent most of their time trying not to leave a trace. "I'm glad you came," he said, closing the door softly behind me. His voice was deeper in person, carrying a weight that matched the man standing before me. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "This feels complicated?" Aiden laughed lightly, though there was no humor in it. "You have no idea. For a while, we just talked. Or rather, I talked, and he listened. I told him about my family, about how I'd moved here to escape their suffocating judgment. He nodded along, his eyes softening as I spoke. When I finally asked about him, he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It's not easy for me," he said after a long pause. "I've spent most of my life pretending to be someone I'm not. My marriage was part of that. Everyone thought I had the perfect life, but inside, I felt like I was drowning." "Why are you still hiding?" I asked, my voice gentle. He looked at me then, his expression a mix of vulnerability and defiance. "Because people don't understand. They think they do, but when it comes down to it, they don't. My ex-wife, my neighbors, even my friends, if they knew." His words hung in the air, unfinished. But I understood. The fear of rejection, of being seen as less than, was something I knew all too well. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "But with you," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "it feels different. Like maybe I don't have to pretend." I didn't know who leaned in first, but the next thing I knew, his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, as though we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, and all the tension between us melted away. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a release, a breaking of the barriers we'd both built around ourselves. The night that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Aiden was intense yet tender, his touch both firm and gentle. We lost ourselves in each other, the outside world fading away until it was just us. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not just for who I was, but for who I could be. When I woke up the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the window felt almost intrusive. I turned over to find Aiden still asleep, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like if this were our reality, a life where we didn't have to hide or make excuses. But reality has a way of intruding when you least expect it. As I quietly got dressed, trying not to wake him, there was a loud knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding as Aiden stirred beside me. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice groggy. "It's me," a woman's voice replied. "I'm here to grab the rest of my stuff." Aiden's eyes shot open, and in an instant, he was out of bed. "You need to go," he whispered urgently, his tone sharp. "Now." I barely had time to react before he was shoving my shoes into my hands and steering me toward the door. As soon as he opened it, I found myself face to face with a woman in her early 30s. She was beautiful, with sharp features and an air of confidence that immediately made me feel out of place. "And who is this?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as they flicked between me and Aiden. "He's no one," Aiden said quickly, his tone cold and dismissive. "Just a neighbor who needed help with something." I felt my stomach drop. The warmth and tenderness of the night before vanished in an instant, replaced by a crushing sense of humiliation. "Just a neighbor?" I echoed, my voice trembling with disbelief. Aiden avoided my gaze, his jaw tight. "You should leave," he said, his words cutting through me like a blade. The woman looked at me then, her expression a mix of suspicion and pity. Before I could say anything, the hallway began to fill with the sound of murmurs. Neighbors were stepping out of their apartments, drawn by the commotion. My chest tightened as the weight of their stares bore down on me. "I spent the night with him," I blurted out, my voice louder than I intended. "And now he's pretending I don't exist." The crowd gasped, and Aiden's face darkened. "Don't do this," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do," I shot back, my anger outweighing my fear. "You wanted this as much as I did. Stop lying to everyone, including yourself." The tension snapped like a rubber band. Aiden's fist came down hard on the doorframe, the sound echoing through the corridor. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice filled with a fury I hadn't seen before. I stumbled backward, my legs shaky. But before I could turn to leave, he grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" he hissed, his eyes wild. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The last thing I remember was the pain, a sharp, searing ache as his fist connected with my face. Then everything went dark. The first thing I noticed was the beeping. Slow, rhythmic, and annoyingly persistent. As I tried to open my eyes, a sharp pain shot through my head, forcing me to groan softly. My mouth felt dry, and my body was heavy as though every muscle had been drained of energy. It took a few moments for the haze to clear enough for me to realize where I was. The hospital room was sterile, its white walls almost blinding under the harsh fluorescent lights. I turned my head, wincing at the pain, and saw a nurse standing near the foot of my bed. She was adjusting the IV drip, her expression neutral but professional. "You're awake," she said, her voice calm. "Take it easy. You've been through a lot." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. The nurse handed me a small cup of water, which I drank gratefully. The cool liquid eased the dryness, and I managed to croak out a question. "What happened?" She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You were brought in by paramedics. Your injuries were significant. Do you remember anything?" The memories came rushing back like a flood. Aiden's face twisted in anger, his hands gripping my arm, the sound of neighbors whispering in the background. And then, the blow, the searing pain and the darkness that followed. My stomach churned as the reality of it all sank in. I was attacked, I murmured, my voice trembling, by my neighbor. The nurse's expression softened, but she said nothing. Instead, she patted my hand gently before leaving the room. Moments later, a police officer walked in, his uniform crisp and his demeanor serious. He introduced himself as Officer Harris and took a seat by my bed. "Jamie, I need to ask you a few questions about what happened," he began, pulling out a small notepad. "Can you tell me everything you remember?" I recounted the events as best as I could, my voice faltering at times as the emotions overwhelmed me. Officer Harris listened intently, his pen moving swiftly across the page. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowed. "We've spoken to some of your neighbors," he said carefully. "They confirmed hearing shouting and seeing you outside Mr. Foster's apartment. But Mr. Foster claims he was acting in self-defense. He says you tried to force your way into his home." My jaw dropped. "That's a lie. He invited me over. I stopped short, realizing how much of the truth I was about to reveal. He's lying to protect himself. Officer Harris gave me a measured look. "Do you have any evidence to support your claim? Text messages, emails, anything that can prove your relationship?" I hesitated. Aiden and I had communicated primarily through the dating app, and most of our conversations had been deleted after we exchanged numbers. My phone, which I realized I didn't have with me, might still have some messages, but would it be enough? "I'll check my phone," I said quietly. "But you have to believe me. He's not who he says he is." Over the next few days, I stayed in the hospital, my injuries slowly healing. The swelling on my face reduced, but the bruises on my body were a painful reminder of what had happened. My phone was eventually returned to me, and I combed through it for any evidence that could prove my story. There were a few saved messages from Aiden, just enough to show that we'd been in contact, but nothing explicitly damning. Meanwhile, the whispers in the building grew louder. My neighbors, who once greeted me with polite smiles, now avoided my gaze. I could feel their judgment in the way they spoke in hushed tones as I walked by, their eyes darting away when I looked at them. The isolation was suffocating. One evening, as I sat in my apartment scrolling aimlessly through my phone, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I hesitated, unsure of who it could be. When I finally opened the door, I was surprised to see Aiden's ex-wife standing there, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind her, my mind racing. Why was she here? Did she know the truth about Aiden? Or was this another attempt to protect his lies? "I've been thinking about what happened," she began, crossing her arms. "And I can't shake the feeling that you're not lying. Aiden's been different since our divorce. Distant, secretive. And if there's one thing I've learned about him, it's that he'll do anything to protect his image." Her words felt like both a validation and a warning. "So, you believe me?" I asked cautiously. She nodded slowly. "I don't know the whole story, but I know Aiden. And I know he's capable of doing what you said he did." Her admission was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the damage that had been done. I thanked her for coming, and she left soon after, leaving me alone with my thoughts. If even his ex-wife could see through his facade, Why couldn't anyone else? Determined to clear my name, I decided to take action. I reached out to Officer Harris and shared the messages I'd found on my phone, along with everything Aiden's ex-wife had told me. While it wasn't definitive proof, it was enough for the police to take a closer look at Aiden's story. In the meantime, I avoided him as much as possible. Every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway or saw his shadow through the peephole, a wave of anxiety washed over me. The man who had once made me feel safe and wanted now represented everything I feared most. The turning point came when one of my neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Clark, knocked on my door. She'd been one of the few people who hadn't avoided me since the incident, and I'd always sensed a kindness in her that set her apart from the others. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice gentle. "I saw something that night. Something you should know." My heart raced as she explained how she'd witnessed Aiden pulling me into his apartment earlier that evening. "I didn't think much of it at the time," she admitted, "but after everything that's happened, I realize now that I should have said something sooner." Her testimony, combined with the messages and the inconsistencies in Aiden's story, finally gave the police enough to move forward. Aiden was arrested for assault, and while the case was far from over, it felt like a small victory. The days following Aiden's arrest felt like a whirlwind. For the first time since the incident, I allowed myself to breathe, albeit cautiously. While his absence brought some relief, the scars, both physical and emotional, remained fresh. My bruises were fading, but the memory of his anger, the sharpness of his words, and the violence of his actions were etched into me like an unshakable shadow. I spent most of my days inside, avoiding the prying eyes of my neighbors. Their whispers still followed me wherever I went, and the weight of their judgment was suffocating. Mrs. Clark's testimony had been pivotal, and I couldn't thank her enough. But even her kindness couldn't erase the loneliness I felt. I didn't just want to be believed. I wanted to be understood. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through endless streams of social media to distract myself, a message popped up on my phone. It was from an unknown number. "I'm sorry." 2 simple words. My heart stopped, and for a moment, I stared at the screen, unsure if I was imagining things. I typed a response with trembling fingers. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "You know who?" Anger and fear surged through me. How dare he reach out to me after everything he'd done? My first instinct was to call the police, but a part of me hesitated. Against my better judgment, I typed back, "What do you want?" There was a long pause before the next message appeared. "I need to explain. Please." I threw my phone onto the couch as if it had burned me. The nerve of him to think he could justify what he'd done. And yet, a part of me was curious. What could he possibly say to make this right? The following day, I couldn't shake the weight of Aiden's message. His words haunted me. Not because I believed him, but because I wanted to confront him, to see him face the consequences of his actions. Against my better judgment, I texted him back. "Fine. One meeting. Public place." He responded almost immediately. "Tonight. The park. 8 p.m. The hours leading up to the meeting felt endless. My mind raced with questions. Why did he want to meet? What could he possibly say? More importantly, was I making a mistake by agreeing to this? Despite my doubts, I arrived at the park just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the empty benches and winding paths. I spotted him almost immediately. He was sitting on a bench near the fountain, his head bowed and his hands clasped tightly together. He looked different, less imposing, almost vulnerable, but I reminded myself not to be fooled. Vulnerability could be a weapon, and Aiden was no stranger to using whatever tools he had to manipulate those around him. "Jamie," he said as I approached, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." I stood a few feet away, my arms crossed defensively. "Say what you need to say, and make it quick." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I messed up, I know that. What I did was unforgivable, and I'm not here to make excuses. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for everything." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost believed him. But then I remembered the lies, the anger, and the violence. "Sorry doesn't erase what you did," I said, my voice firm. "You humiliated me, attacked me, and then tried to turn everyone against me. Why should I believe anything you say now?" Aiden looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Shame? Desperation? "You're right," he admitted. "You have no reason to trust me, but I wasn't lying when I said I was drowning. I've been running from who I am for so long that I don't even know how to stop." "That's not my problem," I snapped. "You don't get to hurt people just because you're too scared to face yourself." He flinched at my words, and for a moment, I saw the cracks in his armor. But before I could say anything else, he stood up abruptly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he said quietly. "And I wanted to thank you for making me realize I can't keep living like this." Without another word, he walked away, leaving me standing by the fountain, confused and emotionally drained. The days following Aiden's arrest felt like a cruel paradox. On one hand, his absence brought a sense of relief. The suffocating tension of knowing he was just a few feet away, lurking behind his apartment door, was gone. But on the other hand, the aftermath of his actions lingered like a storm that refused to dissipate. The bruises on my face had started to fade, but the whispers and stares from my neighbors seemed to intensify. Every time I stepped into the hallway, I felt their eyes on me. Some looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't been staring, while others held their gaze, unashamed in their judgment. The air in the building was thick with gossip, and I was the subject of every conversation. At first, I tried to ignore it. I kept my head down, avoided unnecessary interactions, and told myself it didn't matter what they thought. But the weight of their judgment was relentless. It pressed on me from all sides, a constant reminder that in their eyes, I was the outsider, the troublemaker who had disrupted their peaceful little community. One particularly suffocating afternoon, I overheard a group of neighbors talking as I returned from the grocery store. They stood near the elevator, their voices hushed but loud enough for me to catch snippets of their conversation. "I heard he provoked Aiden," one woman whispered, her tone dripping with disdain. "That's why things got out of hand." "Honestly, I don't blame Aiden," another replied. "He's always been such a nice guy. It's a shame someone like that moved in here." Their words cut deeper than I expected. My hands tightened around the grocery bags as I willed myself to keep walking. But as I passed them, their voices trailed off, and I felt the weight of their stares on my back. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. My apartment felt 1,000 miles away, and when I finally reached it, I slammed the door shut behind me and sank to the floor. How had this become my life? I had moved here to escape judgment, to find freedom, and yet I was right back where I started. The people in this building didn't see me. They only saw Aiden's version of the story. And Aiden, with his charm and carefully crafted facade, had them all convinced. The final blow came later that evening when I found a note taped to my door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. Stop lying. We know the truth. I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. The urge to scream, to rip it into pieces, was overwhelming. But instead, I crumpled it in my hand and tossed it into the trash. Tears burned in my eyes as I sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of isolation settle over me like a heavy blanket. The truth was, I was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of explaining. Tired of carrying the burden of a story no one seemed willing to believe. But as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, another emotion began to surface. Anger. Not the kind of anger that consumes you, but the kind that fuels you. The kind that makes you stand up and say, enough. If Aiden wanted to control the narrative, he was in for a fight. I wasn't going to let him silence me. The following morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to hide anymore. If people wanted to talk, let them. If they wanted to believe Aiden's lies, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to let their opinions dictate my life. I had been through too much to back down now. I started by calling Officer Harris, the detective assigned to my case. We had spoken briefly after Aiden's arrest, but I hadn't been ready to fully cooperate. Now, I was determined to see this through. "Officer Harris," I said when he answered, "I'm ready to file my statement." His voice was calm but firm. "I'm glad to hear that, Jamie. Take your time, and let me know if you need help with anything." Filing the statement was harder than I anticipated. Reliving that night, putting everything into words, felt like reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. I described everything: the initial attraction, the night we spent together, the way his demeanor changed when his ex-wife showed up, and the violence that followed. I didn't sugarcoat anything, even when it hurt. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking and my throat felt dry. But there was a sense of catharsis in finally putting everything down on paper. This was my story, and no one, not Aiden, not the neighbors, not the anonymous note leaver, was going to take it from me. A few days later, I received a call from Mrs. Clark, the elderly neighbor who had been kind to me throughout this ordeal. She invited me over for tea, and though I was hesitant at first, I accepted. Her apartment was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, judgmental atmosphere of the building. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said as she poured tea into delicate china cups. "I know you've been going through a lot, and I want you to know that not everyone in this building believes Aiden." Her words were a balm to my battered spirit. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking. "You have no idea how much that means to me." She patted my hand gently. "You remind me of my son," she said softly. "He went through something similar years ago. People can be cruel, but the truth has a way of coming to light. Just keep fighting." Her encouragement bolstered me, and over the next few weeks I began to rebuild my sense of self. I started going for walks, venturing out to the nearby coffee shop, and even striking up conversations with a few neighbors who seemed more open-minded. It wasn't easy, but each small step felt like progress. The days after Aiden's return were heavy with tension. His presence seemed to reignite the gossip in the building, and every glance or hushed conversation felt like an accusation. Avoiding him was exhausting, but the thought of confronting him again made my stomach churn. One afternoon, as I passed the mailroom, I overheard a neighbor say, He's making such a big deal out of this. Aiden seems like he just wants to move on. I clenched my fists and kept walking, refusing to let them see the anger and hurt on my face. It wasn't just about what Aiden had done. It was the way he continued to manipulate everyone around him. His charm and lies were convincing, and I was left fighting an uphill battle to reclaim my own truth. Later that evening, Mrs. Clark knocked on my door. She handed me a small notebook, her face lined with concern. "I've been keeping notes," she said. "I thought they might help." The notebook detailed conversations and observations about Aiden, including one chilling entry. He says therapy is helping, but he also joked about how easy it is to say what people want to hear. Her words bolstered my resolve. Aiden was still trying to control the narrative, but with Mrs. Clark's support, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about my story anymore. It was about ensuring no one else would be hurt by his lies. That night, as I reviewed the notes, I felt the first spark of hope I'd had in weeks. The fight wasn't over, but I wasn't alone anymore. This story is a powerful reminder of the complexities of relationships and the bravery required to confront lies and injustice. Jamie's journey reflects the emotional toll of standing up for yourself, especially when faced with manipulation and societal judgment. Despite the odds, Jamie's resilience shines through as he refuses to let Aiden's lies define him. Aiden's character reveals the dangers of living in denial. His refusal to face his own identity and the shame he carried led him to lash out at Jamie, harming someone he once shared intimacy with. This serves as a cautionary tale about the damage unresolved fears and secrets can cause, not just to others but to oneself. His actions remind us of the importance of self-acceptance and honesty. The story also highlights the role of community. Mrs. Clark's unwavering support and the eventual help from other neighbors demonstrate how important allies are in difficult times. Their belief in Jamie not only validated his truth, but also gave him the strength to keep fighting for justice. This emphasizes the power of standing together and supporting those who need it most. Ultimately, Jamie's fight was not just for himself, but for others who might be hurt by Aiden's manipulation. His courage to speak out, even when it felt like the world was against him, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the importance of seeking justice. Hey, now that you've finished Jamie's story, what's your rating for it? Share your score in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think of these real gay stories and their themes of love, betrayal, and resilience. What's your take on Jamie's actions? Do you think he handled the situation the best way possible? Could he have done something differently? And what are your thoughts on Aiden's struggles and choices? Let me know what you think of these characters and their decisions. I'm excited to hear your perspective.